No one expected me to compose music, I just did. What I have done is what was in me, the combination of New York, where I was born, and the rising, exhilarating rhythm of it, with centuries of hereditary feeling back of me. They ask me what I'm trying to do, and I can only say I'm trying to express what is in me. Some people have the ability to put their feelings into words or music. There are thousands who have the same feeling and are mute. Those of us who can must speak for those who cannot. But we must be honest about it.
Today is a very special day in the history of 20th century music. It's also a very special day if you're a Gershwin fan. And I'll come to that in a second. But first, I just want to thank my friend, Sir Ben Kingsley, for kindly recording those words of Gershwin for me. We worked together on a BBC show that I wrote called Gershwin in Focus. That was in the last century to celebrate Gershwin's Centenary. And a few years after that, when I was recovering from a dreadful car accident, Ben very generously gave me a special possession of his, which I'd often seen when I visited him. It's this. It's a drawing by George Gershwin. It's actually what looks like a telephone doodle, perhaps, but Gershwin was a brilliant artist, visual artist, as well as a brilliant composer. It's signed as a signature as well, you can see. And this was a very special gift from Ben, which I treasure to this day. I'm told that people quite like the show and tell aspect of these chats. I have something here Edward Jablonski gave me many years ago. It doesn't look like much. It's an envelope here, and it's filled with broken pieces. You probably can't even see that that is an original recording that was the property of George Gershwin, and he's written on it, I got rhythm variations. It was a recording from a radio broadcast that he had in his possession. It's all in pieces because Edward Jablonski wanted to publish the recordings of these radio broadcasts, and he spoke with Ira, who had these original possessions of his brother in his library in California, and Edward Jablonski in New York wanted to have them so he could make copies. So Ira sent him that particular recording. By the time it arrived in New York, it was smashed to pieces. Ed phoned Ira and said, "Oh, it's ruined. It's completely ruined. I opened it up, it's just all in pieces." And Ira just said, "Oh, that's okay. I made a copy." I said, "Ed, have you still got that broken up disc?" He said, "Yes, here it is." And then he gave it to me. Just one of many possessions that have a rather fun story behind them. I've also got Gershwin's car, his 1936 Cord. You have to remember, Gershwin was a lot smaller than we are. This year is a special year because 100 years ago, the Rhapsody in Blue was first performed in New York on February 12th, 1924. But an even more significant date was 100 years ago today, January the 7th, 1924. This is the date that Gershwin put on his manuscript. I like to refer to it as the creation date. Now, there's a lot of mystery as to the significance of that date and what came before and after it, and I'll try to unravel some of that now for you. But the thing is, there are so many myths about Gershwin, and they've been propagated by many, many authors. I have a large collection of Gershwin, of course, in my library here. Some remarkable books there, books I'm very fond of, written in several cases by people I know personally. But there's only one book that actually gets the facts right of the birth of Rhapsody in Blue, at least up to a point, and that's this one by Howard Pollock. I was in touch with him when he was writing this, and we exchanged communications on various things to do with Gershwin's piano performances. And here's the problem with the story of Rhapsody in Blue. Who do you believe? George Gershwin or Ira Gershwin? Because they told two different stories. Actually, there's a third story told by George Gershwin himself. So who knows what one should believe? But there are some facts. So we can explore the facts as well. And this is all quite interesting because it sheds some light on how Gershwin worked, how composers work, and how this particular piece came into being. The famous story that's told is that Gershwin had forgotten all about being asked to write this piece by Paul Whiteman, the jazz band leader, until an announcement appeared in a newspaper on the 4th of January 1924, and suddenly, before Gershwin even realized it, he had to cobble together a piece of music, and it was only 5 weeks before the premiere. Now, I've told this story myself in my concerts when I didn't have the full information to hand. I'll just read you the announcement in the newspaper. And here's another problem. Biographers seem to disagree on what is the name of the newspaper. There were two newspapers, the New York Herald and the New York Tribune. Now they became the New York Herald Tribune, one newspaper, in March 1924. But in January 1924, there were two separate papers. And some authors say it's the New York Herald. I think that's probably the case, but a lot of other authors say it's the New York Tribune. Just another little area of dispute over Rhapsody in Blue, but this is the story. A little heading, Whiteman, judges named. Committee will decide what is American music. Among the members of the committee of judges who will pass on what is American music at the Paul Whiteman concert to be given at Aeolian Hall Tuesday afternoon, February 12th, will be Sergei Rachmaninoff, Yasha Heifetz, Ephraim Zimbalist and Alma Gluck. Leonard Liebling, editor of the Musical Courier, will be chairman of the Critics Committee, which is to be composed of the leading musical critics of the United States. This question of just what is American music has aroused a tremendous interest in music circles, and Mr. Whiteman is receiving every phase of manuscript, from blues to symphonies. George Gershwin is at work on a jazz concerto. Irving Berlin is writing a syncopated tone poem, and Victor Herbert is working on an American suite. George Gershwin was playing a game of billiards at the time when his brother Ira picked up the New York Herald and read this article. And the story goes that Gershwin knew nothing about it and suddenly had to get working. He complained at first to Paul Whiteman that he couldn't do it, and then he composed it anyway. There's a lot of spin in this story because it's more fun. It's a fun story, it sounds exciting. Paul Whiteman was a master publicist. He knew how to spin a story. You can tell from that paragraph the massive spin, all these famous names. And by the way, Sergei Rachmaninoff was a huge fan of Paul Whiteman. He also became a huge fan of Gershwin, but he wasn't there for the premiere because he was giving a concert at the Ararat Temple in Kansas City on that same evening, February 12th, 1924. And even as remarkable a musician as Rachmaninoff could not be in two places at once. So there's one myth we dispel immediately. But then here's an article from, this is a newspaper. It's the Brooklyn Daily Eagle. I'll just read it to you now. The Brooklyn Daily Eagle, February the 17th, 1924, so only 5 days after the premiere, and it talks about the birth of this work. The journalist is actually interviewing Gershwin. The conditions under which it was written are interesting. One day, about 3 months ago, Gershwin happened accidentally upon Paul Whiteman, who told him of the projected Experiment in Modern Music concert. "I want you to write something for it," said Whiteman. "Oh, all right," replied Gershwin offhandedly, "I'll do it." Tied up with the production of his new play and other matters, Gershwin let the matter slide, until suddenly one day, shortly after the first of the year, he chanced upon an announcement of the concert with himself slated to appear. That was a challenge to his sportsmanship. Feeling duty-bound to make good his promise, he sat down on January the 7th and wrote the first page of the Rhapsody. In the subsequent 3 weeks, Though handicapped by numerous interruptions, he finished it, though he says it is not wholly set yet. He is still likely to improvise at the piano, but the general outlines are determined and most of the detail is worked out. We have a problem here, because here's a letter from Gershwin himself to his friend Isaac Goldberg, who was writing a biography, which came out in 1931. It's quoted in Howard Pollock's excellent book on Gershwin. I'll read it to you in full because it has some significant information in it. This is George Gershwin writing. Suddenly an idea occurred to me. There had been so much chatter about the limitations of jazz. Jazz, they said, had to be in strict time. It had to cling to dance rhythms. I resolved, if possible, to kill that misconception with one sturdy blow. Inspired by this aim, I set to work composing with unwonted rapidity. No set plan was in my mind, no structure to which my music would conform. The Rhapsody, as you see, began as a purpose, not a plan. At this stage of the piece, I was summoned to Boston for the premiere of Sweet Little Devil. I had already done some work on the Rhapsody. It was on the train. Now, I'll just stop there for a second. I was summoned to Boston for the premiere of Sweet Little Devil. Well, the premiere of this new show of Gershwin's, which was actually in Boston called The Perfect Lady, it changed its name when it came to New York. The premiere took place on December the 20th, 1923. We also know from the newspaper article I just read to you that Whiteman spoke to Gershwin in early to mid-November 1923. That makes sense because Gershwin had already done a concert in Aeolian Hall of classics and jazz with the soprano Eva Gautier. It was an unusual program of songs by Schoenberg and other recent composers, as well as some American songs by Jerome Kern, George Gershwin, and this created quite a stir. I think Paul Whiteman was there and realized this was something he needed to get in on, this debate over jazz versus classical, or whatever you want to call it.
Jazz is a word which has been used for at least 5 or 6 types of music. It is really a conglomeration of many things. It has a little bit of ragtime, the blues, classicism, and spirituals. The same word trouble surrounds the colloquial use of the phrase classical music. It means as many things as there are people to say it. A man writes a piece of music which he considers serious, but which is pretty awful. He labels his work classic, and an unsuspecting public accepts the label. From any sound-critical standpoint, labels mean nothing at all. Good music is good music, even if you call it oysters.
And so Paul Whiteman spoke to Gershwin in November 1923 to ask him to write something. And Gershwin, by the sound of his own words, jumped at the idea. Of course he did. This is exactly what Gershwin wanted to do. All the stories you read about, he didn't want to do it, he was too busy, are just not true, according to Gershwin's own words. So here we are, he's now attending the premiere of Sweet Little Devil in Boston. So he has to get there for 20th of December. Let's assume he travelled up by train the day before, so that would be December the 19th. As he says, I had already done some work on the Rhapsody. So he'd already been working on this piece even in December 1923. It was on the train, with its steely rhythms, its rattlety-bang that is often so stimulating to a composer, and there I suddenly heard, and even saw on paper, the complete construction of the Rhapsody from beginning to end. No new themes came to me, but I worked on the thematic material already in my mind. By the way, he said no new themes came to him. I've often read that he was inspired by the noise of the train to come up with themes, and certain writers have picked out themes in the Rhapsody in Blue that they think are these themes. But Gershwin's own words, he quite clearly says, no new themes came to me. He already had the ideas in his head. He was just making a plan of the work. But I worked on the thematic material already in my mind and tried to conceive the composition as a whole. I heard it as a sort of musical kaleidoscope of America, of our vast melting pot, of our unduplicated national pep. That's a wonderful word, pep. Of our blues, are metropolitan madness. By the time I reached Boston, I had a definite plot of the piece, as distinguished from its actual substance. So we have the shape of the piece already in existence before December the 20th, 1923. Then he goes on further. Gershwin writes, "As for the middle theme," that's the famous slow theme, As for the middle theme, it came upon me suddenly, as my music sometimes does. I was at the home of a friend just after I got back to Gotham, New York, so he's back from Boston, one assumes just a few days after the premiere, so before Christmas, December 1923. Well, there I was, rattling away at the piano, without a thought of rhapsodies in blue or any other colour. All at once I heard myself playing a theme that must have been haunting me inside, seeking outlet. No sooner had it oozed out of my fingers than I knew I had found it. A week after my return from Boston, I completed the Rhapsody in Blue. Gershwin's own words, "A week after my return from Boston, I completed the Rhapsody in Blue." Let's assume he returned to New York from Boston around December 22nd or 23rd, so before Christmas 1923. A week after that return, he completes the Rhapsody in Blue, so the completion date ought to be January the 1st, 1924. Only 4 days later, we have a newspaper article, and according to Ira Gershwin and many other people, George knew nothing about it. I don't know what Whiteman's talking about. But the piece was already written. It already existed. So how do we explain this? Well, first of all, there's a lot of spin going on. Whiteman knew what was good for publicity. George Gershwin knew what was good for publicity too. It was very exciting that this piece came together in a hurry. It did come together in a hurry. I'm going to give you more detail in a moment. But there's a crucial thing that you need to know here. It's so obvious, but it may not be obvious to people who don't write music. You don't need to write out the score to write a piece of music. It exists inside your head. And it's true of probably every composer. That's how composers like Bach or Mozart are able to write music away from an instrument. Bach would come up with an idea, come up with an entire work. He would then play portions on a keyboard to go over details to check how it sounds, but he's hearing it in his head. It's quite normal. Of course, Beethoven had nothing but that to rely on, hearing music inside his head. People marvel, how could he write the Ninth Symphony? He could only hear it inside his head. Well, it is extraordinary, particularly with the scoring of the orchestra and so on, but it's not as extraordinary as you might think if you realize that that's how composers hear music. When I've written music, it's very, very alive inside my head, more alive inside my head than outside my head. I have no doubt that the Rhapsody in Blue existed complete, perhaps, in George Gershwin's head before he'd written a note of it down. Let's not forget, for example, Gershwin's wonderful piano variations on his show tunes. These are things that I've transcribed and performed many times and recorded. And these are not the short examples that Gershwin published. These are the versions he recorded on 78s and piano rolls, the things that he regaled partygoers with in the 1920s. They're very elaborate, they're very virtuosic, but what's interesting about them is if you compare two different recordings, there aren't many that he recorded twice, but some, Sweet and Low Down, he made a piano roll recording and a 78 recording. That Certain Feeling did the same thing. I Got Rhythm, there are several recordings. If you compare these recordings, you'll see these aren't really improvisations. They're more like pieces of music that evolve. He makes small changes here and there, but they are basically the same piece. And they last 3 minutes. I mean, if we were talking about Chopin, we'd be talking about a Chopin etude or something. A 3-minute work. Gershwin didn't write a note of these down. I mean, until he published his famous songbook in 1932, these didn't exist in written form, just inside his head. But they were vivid and they were real, and they didn't go away. So, Rhapsody in Blue, inside his head, perfectly reasonable. Let's not forget too, there are several repetitious passages in the Rhapsody in Blue. If you take away the repetitions, the 15-minute work is probably less than 10 minutes. So we're expecting Gershwin to remember 10 minutes of music inside his head in a piano version. That's quite reasonable to me. Also, I think it's quite reasonable to think that he wrote it very fast. Again, let's look at the composing process. A lot of time is spent just thinking about things without writing anything. There's a wonderful description from George Sand about Chopin staring out of a window. She got rather fed up with him, how he just stared out of a window instead of working. Actually, he was working. He was formulating things inside his head. He didn't need to play it on the piano to formulate what was going on inside his head. There's no question he was working, but to the outside world, it doesn't look like work. That's why it's so difficult to make films of composers, because it's the most boring thing. It's like watching paint dry. Here's Beethoven working, and he's just sitting there staring in space. Not very interesting. That's why when Hollywood made a film about Beethoven, they had to make it more interesting, and they put in this ludicrous storyline of a landlord banging on the door. Come pay the rent. Come pay the rent. And of course, Beethoven immediately inspired to write. Slight problem. It would have been in German, not English. Obviously, it didn't happen. It was just Hollywood trying desperately to make composing seem more interesting than it really is. Of course, if you are a composer or you love music, it is interesting. I find getting inside Gershwin's mind fascinating. I love poring over anything I can find that gives any hint of how he worked on things. But I'm digressing here because now we get to the article in the newspaper from Paul Whiteman. Now, Paul Whiteman had not given a date for this concert to George Gershwin, so Gershwin probably felt he had plenty of time to finish this work, which was already complete inside his head, we presume. The trouble is, now we have a date, February the 12th, it's 5 weeks away. Of course Gershwin panicked at this point because he hadn't got a neat score, and more importantly, he hadn't orchestrated it. It was in a piano form, and Gershwin was very inexperienced at orchestrating at this moment, and so it would have been very difficult for him in 5 weeks to create an orchestration with very little experience behind him. But this was resolved by Paul Whiteman in a famous phone call they had immediately after Gershwin had seen this newspaper article. Paul Whiteman assured Gershwin that he had an arranger, Ferdy Grofé, who worked for the Paul Whiteman band, who knew the specifics of the unusual instrumentation. In that band, there were a lot of brilliant musicians who doubled up on different instruments. The clarinetist would play a number of different woodwind instruments. There was, of course, a banjo player, a very tiny string section. It was an unusual band, and Ferdy Grofé, the arranger, knew the band very well. But Gershwin still had to write out his piano score, which he didn't have. And so he began writing it out on January the 7th. That's why, if you look at the score, it has that date, January the 7th on the score. That's not the day he began writing the work. Apart from anything else, there are a few telltale signs actually on the score itself. Let's begin with the title, Rhapsody in Blue. It wasn't called Rhapsody in Blue when he was writing it. He didn't know what to call it. He thought of calling it an American Rhapsody. Then Ira came up with this brilliant idea after attending an exhibition of Whistler paintings, probably in Boston, by the way, when they were there at the premiere of The Perfect Lady, Sweet Little Devil in December 1923. And Ira suggested, you have Nocturne in blue and grey, why not Rhapsody in Blue? It was an inspired and brilliant title for the work. So it's called Rhapsody in Blue on this score because it already exists. And then we need to look at the writing of this score. It's very neat. It's very clear. He's even written some instrumentation down. It's clearly a finished score, at least in reduction, piano reduction. There's no sign on this page of composing. This is not a sketch. This is a final version, at least in reduced form. And I'll give you some other examples. At no point in this manuscript are there any signs of compositional activity. Revisions, yes. Changes, things that go on all the time, even when a work is complete. For example, towards the end of the first piano cadenza, Gershwin suggests the scoring for the reappearance of the opening theme. He then crosses out those 4 bars, or actually 6 bars, including a piano scale up, and decides instead to give that to the solo piano to keep it in the cadenza of the pianist. He hasn't changed the music at all. He simply decided, instead of having it played by the jazz band or the orchestra, it's going to be played by the pianist. The harmonies haven't changed, the melody hasn't changed, the rhythm hasn't changed, nothing's changed. Another example, he crosses out 2 bars of a theme, this theme. It's initially written out in 16th notes, semiquavers. He then crosses that out and decides to write it out in longer values, 8th notes, quavers. But again, he hasn't changed the music. It was simply a decision of how to write out the work. Many composers have done that. Chopin completely rewrote his tarantelle in a different time signature in order to put the bar lines in different places. He didn't change the music, he'd already written the music. Again, here the music hasn't changed. Gershwin simply hadn't quite decided how it should be presented on a score. So yes, it's revisions taking place, but I don't see any sign of him composing the work here. And then we come to another often told aspect of this piece, and that is that the piano part is missing and Gershwin improvised it at the first performance. I'm afraid I've told that story myself many times in concerts. But the truth is, the piano part isn't missing. It's there, the entire score, beautifully written out. The only places where it's not written out is when it's so obvious what the piano should be doing, because it's a repetition of previous passages. There's no need to write it out again. There's a slight grey area at the beginning of the finale, just 8 bars where he didn't put in the piano part. But the following few bars, the piano is doing the exact figuration it would have done in those missing 8 bars. I think that Gershwin had a pretty good idea of what the piano would be doing there. By then, that's towards the end of the work, by then he was beginning to run out of time. Remember, the piece was already composed, but not written out. And writing out music is a laborious process. Chopin hated it, many composers do not enjoy it. It takes a lot of time and it's not very exciting, but it has to be done. And so this is what Gershwin was doing, and he had to produce scores for Feu de Grofe to orchestrate. And here's the thing, he would hand out a page as soon as he'd written it out, Feu de Grofe would take it away and orchestrate it. That wouldn't have been possible if he was still composing the work. Nobody writes a piece of music beginning with measure 1 and ending in the final measure. I mean, 1 or 2 people have done that, but it's most unusual. Gershwin himself talked about creating a plot for the piece back in December 1923. So by the time he's writing out this piece, he knows exactly where the piece is going. There are 1 or 2 grey areas. There's a couple of piano cadenzas that he put in, which he later cut. So it's not totally complete. So it's a question of semantics, isn't it? When was this work written? Was it written when it was completed inside his head? Was it written when it was finally put onto paper? But what was not happening at this moment, he was not composing the work. That's a very different process. He was making changes, perhaps, very incidental changes to scoring. But I have not seen any sign of him reworking a theme, changing even the form of the work. These changes are very, very straightforward and the kind of thing that happens all the time, even after a work has been completed. And that calls into question the whole Ferde Greffet involvement. Ferde Greffet at one point tried to suggest that he'd composed the Rhapsody in Blue. He absolutely did not compose the Rhapsody in Blue. He did a marvellous job on the orchestration, although one must remember that he was visiting Gershwin every single day. Not only had Gershwin put suggestions in the score, but there was no question of doubt that Gershwin and Greffet would have been conferring the whole time about how the music should be scored. Of course, Greffet knew the Whiteman Band probably better than Gershwin from that point of view, but Gershwin knew what he wanted his music to sound like. For example, the opening, the famous opening, the clarinet glissando. And there's a story that's been told differently according to who you read. Ross Gorman was the clarinetist who, according to one story, began the opening scale. It's a scale in B flat, and did a swoop at the end, turning it into glissando. And Gershwin liked it so much he kept it. But a more likely story is that Ross Gorman was messing around on the clarinet and doing swoops and things, which he was fond of doing. It was a very unusual thing that he did on the clarinet and just sort of showing off. And George Gershwin was there hearing this and liked it and thought how brilliant that would be for the opening scale. And so he asked Gorman if he could possibly do that for the opening scale. According to one account, Gorman said it'd be very difficult to do that, but Gershwin insisted, and Gorman eventually complied with Gershwin's request. So even with the glissando, it's really still Gershwin who wanted that at the beginning, using the skill of this particular clarinetist he'd heard. What about the slow theme? The slow theme, according to Ira and according to Ferde Greffet, came from an earlier period in Gershwin's life. Ira said it was from a notebook, and Ira wanted it in the work, and Gershwin was reluctant to put it in. He thought it was too sentimental. Gershwin's own written record doesn't back that story up at all. George Gershwin is the one who should know. He was improvising that just a few days after he returned from Boston at the end of December 1923 and realized it was right for the work. The point is that Gershwin wanted people to play his music the way he wrote it. When he was writing Porgy and Bess, he was very specific in the cast he chose. Certain voices, people who weren't famous at all, that he auditioned them all, and clearly, just like he did with the scoring of the Rhapsody in Blue, as he spoke to Greffet, when it came to Porgy and Bess, he had a very clear idea of what his music should sound like. To play the music of a composer in an authentic way is not to destroy it. Some people think it's like covering the work in cobwebs, sticking it in a museum case instead of making it live. It doesn't have to be like that. You can stick to what the composer wanted and live it at the same time. That's the wonderful thing about music. That's what makes it so special. You can live and breathe it while still being faithful to the composer. Many pianists love adding their extra notes to Rhapsody in Blue. Now, you might think I've done the same with my own recording. My recording was actually sticking very closely to Gershwin's piano roll recording. Any things I put in there that weren't in the published score came from Gershwin. They didn't come from me, they came from Gershwin, from his recordings. I always say, if you don't respect the composer enough to follow what they've written, then present your own music. And then you might find out what it feels like when someone else doesn't play your music the way you wrote it. There's a video link at the end of this chat to my performance of the Rhapsody in Blue, played just by me, solo piano, based on Gershwin's four-hand piano roll recording. And you can follow along with the original pencil manuscript of Gershwin. So you can see how much what I'm playing deviates from the original manuscript, which is virtually never, because it wasn't a sketch, it was a manuscript, which he began writing out on January the 7th, 100 years ago today, on this very special anniversary of the one and only Rhapsody in Blue.
I'd like my music to keep people, all kinds of people, awake when they should be sleeping. I'd like my compositions to be so vital that I'd be required by law to dispense sedatives with each score sold.